Afrocentrism, Mythical Past and Imagined Homes by Stephen Howe, narrated by eminent W.E.B. Part 1, Ancestors and Influences. Chapter 2, Pan-Africanism and Negritude. The pioneering black political thinker Edward Wilmot Blyden, writing well over a century ago, neatly encapsulated the reasons why a language of otherness, of absolute difference, has seemed powerfully attractive to those who felt themselves to be victims of racial vilification. It is a question of difference of endowment and difference of destiny. No amount of training or culture will make the Negro a European. On the other hand, no lack of training or deficiency of culture will make the European a Negro. The two races are not moving in the same groove with an immeasurable distance between them, but on parallel lines. They will never meet in the plane of their activities so as to coincide in capacity or performance. They are not identical as something but unequal. They are distinct but equal. Quoted in Madimbe, 1988, 118, original emphasis. This polarization of alternatives resonates through more than 100 years of argument over race, culture, and human capacity in colonial and racially oppressed situations. It stated the cruel dilemma for victims of race stereotyping: either accept a European conception of human worth and achievement and be judged inferior by it, or proclaim otherness, a radically incomprehensible ethos and destiny. Even if in practice individuals have mixed the approaches, and if increasingly self-conscious and sophisticated syncretic models have emerged, some intellectual as well as political debate still operates with these sharp polarities. Arguably, indeed, their antagonisms have become more extreme in recent decades. They are related to, though in principle distinct from, the more directly political clash of integrationist and separatist programs, which inevitably had and has its most powerful relevance for culturally distinct groups within plural societies. For sheer weight, intensity, persistence of negative prejudice, maybe no major human group has been so burdened by others' attitudes as have Africans. Invidious, though some comparisons always are, a mass of European literature over an extended historical period quite seriously posed the question whether Africans were human at all, and sometimes answered it negatively. Thus, it was probably inevitable that some of the most dramatic affirmations of otherness as declarations of cultural independence should come from intellectuals of African descent, and that they should come in the diaspora, more on the continent itself. In the Americas, both access to education and publishing, an experience of cultural insecurity born from the destruction of or displacement from traditional African modes of life, and from long exposure to racist calumny, were greater than they were on the African continent. One can trace diasporic responses asserting a specific African cultural ethos and destiny, a form of cultural nationalism, at least as far back as Blyden, or, before him, Martin Delany and David Walker, Afro-American intellectuals of the pre-Civil War years. The most striking and influential cultural expressions of this stance came, however, from the Francophone Caribbean, and to a lesser extent the Evolés of French West Africa, the educated minority whom the colonial rulers judged to have attained to full-fledged Frenchness. With the Negritude literary movement of the 1930s and afterwards, the pronouncements of its leading figures, Aimé Césaire, Léon Dumas, Leopold Sédar Senghor, set the tone for much of the Third World and ethnic minority cultural nationalism that has followed. See especially from amid a vast literature, Mudimbe, 1992. Negritude has moreover become one of the main influences on contemporary Afrocentric and similar theories, in part directly, in part through elective affinity, and even more through the meditation of what became labeled ethnophilosophy, and of the most ubiquitous presence in Third Worldist cultural theory, Frantz Fanon. In subsequent commentary, it has often also been linked and sometimes misleadingly lumped together with the political separatism of which Marcus Garvey's movement was the most famous expression, though intellectually one of the least coherent and, in terms of direct political impact, among the least successful. In fact, though the founding figures of Negritude emphasized African cultural and psychological distinctiveness, but did not, on the whole, have a separatist political program or even necessarily any political program at all. One must thus beware of thinking of the Negritude movement and its descendants as only and always figures of nationalists, anti-colonialists, or even anti-racist reaction. For a start, it is highly questionable how much it can accurately be described as anti-colonial. Its main precursor, Haitian Nouaisme, was directed at least as much against an indigenous mulatto elite as it was against neo-colonial French or U.S. influences in independent Haiti. C-1981, semicolon, Nichols, 1979, chapters 5 through 7. Senghor and even more Césaire coupled their culturalist rejection of European hegemony with strong political loyalties to the French connection. Negritude was, as Afro-American critic Charles Johnson rightly suggests, not philosophy. We have a doctrine, not analysis. 1988:19. Indeed, it may well be, as Valentin Mudimbe persuasively argues, that it was Jean-Paul Sartre, not the Negritude poets themselves, who turned a literary movement into a political philosophy, thus stultifying in the rhetoric of absolute otherness. Senghor had taught Sartre for a cloak to celebrate Negritude. He was given a shroud. Mudimbe, 1988:85. And of course, many other crucial oppositional thinkers of the African diaspora, like W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, and George Padmore, explicitly rejected cultural nationalism and adhered, most of the time, to more universalist and rationalist philosophies derived in large part from Marxism. The notion of Pan-Africanism, meanwhile, not only straddled these divisions, but came over time to bear at least four fairly distinguishable meanings. 1. the aspiration for political cooperation and awareness of a common experience of discrimination among peoples of African descent wherever they may live. This was the earliest usage of the term. 2. The claim that people of African descent, wherever they live, have and should rediscover common socio-cultural traditions derived from their shared origins. Some versions of this belief speak in terms of distinctive African personality involving shared philosophies, attitudes to life, or modes of expression and behavior. In the Francophone world, this latter variant came to be known as negritude or an Haiti noirisme. More recently, in the Anglophone world, and especially the USA, similar beliefs have adopted the title Afrocentrism. 3. Belief in the need for the political unity, or at least much closer political, economic, and cultural cooperation between the states of African continent, or in some variants in sub-Saharan sector. This especially political and geographical conception of the term is the most widespread within Africa, whereas outside its definitions, 1 and 2 are perhaps more often meant. This has often caused misunderstanding. 4. In some situations, especially in South Africa, Pan-Africanism has become a political label of those who tend to stress the racial element in group conflict and identity as against emphasis on social class, political ideology, and universalist principles. There is no one founder of Pan-Africanism. W.E.B. Du Bois may be seen perhaps as the effective initiator of a political movement in the first sense above. The most important early exponent of the idea was probably Edward Wilmot Blyden, born in St. Thomas in the West Indies in 1932. Blyden was one of the first to emphasize past African cultural achievements and the need for racial solidarity and pride. He also, however, adopted a somewhat mystical connection of African character, which he saw as essentially spiritual and ill-fitted for technical or scientific achievement. He was extremely hostile toward people of mixed ancestry, and in later life he became an apologist for European colonialism in Africa. Lynch, 1967. Other important progenitors included Martin R. Delaney, 1812 to 1885, a free-born Afro-American from Virginia who asserted the cultural distinctiveness and African heritage of Black Americans as well as campaigning for their political rights. He became an early advocate of Back to Africa ideas. Equally important, though this time more beyond the USA, was James Africanus Horton, 1835 through 1883, a London-trained Sierra Leonese surgeon who, for his critiques of racial theories and advocacy of West African independence, has been called the father of modern African political thought. Fryer, 1984, 277, quoting George Shepardson. For the negritude concept itself, the most influential figure was Leopold Sédar Senghor, the poet and cultural theorist who later became president of Senegal. His beliefs and those of his circle were forged in France in the 1930s. Under pressure of the prejudice which African and Caribbean students, visitors, and immigrants encountered there, Senghor recalled in a fairly typical experience, if a less bitter one than, say, that famously recalled by France Fanon, that it was only on going to Paris that I become conscious of belonging to the basic category of Negro, quoted in Villon, 1990:97. The idea that migrants visitors or students from the different far-flung colonies of the French Empire had a shared identity was, then in the beginning, imposed mainly by the prejudices of others. Yet such categories did not overcome the divisions and mutual suspicions between Africans and West Indians in the Paris of the 1930s. Fryer, 99 through 102, see also Arnold, 1981. Nor did they by any means necessarily lead to a total rejection of Western civilization and the universalist ideas, though this has often in our time come to be seen as the most natural response. Senghor's pronouncements that African mentalities and approaches to knowledge were entirely distinct from those of Europeans gained a wide audience and have had many followers, including, as we shall see, numerous contemporary American Afrocentric thinkers. He asserted European reasoning is analytical, discursive by utilization. Negro American reasoning is intuitive by participation. Senghor, 1964, 74. But this was not an absolute division. In his theory, these were psychological tendencies, no more. They were complementary rather than antagonistic, and they were outweighed in significance by shared human traits. In Senghor's early writings, the universalist category of humanism is persistently central, and it's invariably used as a positive term, even subsequently when he came to stress more and more insistently the basic contrast between European and African personalities. He continued to issue disclaimers and occasional reminders that all human qualities might be found, albeit in different mixes, among all peoples. Villon, 1990, 251. It was again left to Jean-Paul Sartre to provide the sweeping essentialist claims which on the whole Senghor avoided. Senghor's attitude was very far from the latter Afrocentric practice of ostentatiously and fraudulently disavowing any European intellectual influence. His debts to Marx, Durkheim, and Weber, as well as to French literary models, were openly proclaimed, and there remained a kind of universalism in his ambitions to make of negritude a concept that might take its place among the great principles of his day, grand principles such as humanism and socialism. Villon, 1990, 251 through 2. He also remained selective in what he attacked about European legacies. He never, for instance, criticized Christianity as such, and he insisted that far from being intrinsically separatist, negritude is Africa's contribution to the common universal civilization. Senghor quoted in Villon, 1990, 266. The aspect of negritude which became most famous, Senghor's and Cesar's claim that African people had special qualities of intuition, spontaneity, creativity, and spirituality as against the European strengths in logical and scientific thought must be read in that context. Later uses and abuses of negritude, however, tended to retain the essentialist claim about specific racial mentalities while abandoning the universalist humanism in which Senghor embedded it. Nor did the shocking experience of white hostility and cultural disdain by any means necessarily produce the populist response, seeking refuge in ideas of tradition and folklore culture, which later appeared mandatory in some circles. Senghor and his colleagues in the movement formed around the Paris-based magazine Présence Africaine were an artistic experimentalists, clearly parts of the cultural avant-garde of their day in France. That particular association has since appeared much weakened, even angrily repudiated by many. Instead, the essentially negative reaction against alien domination has tended to become closely allied with populism, anti-intellectualism, and originally functionalist notion of the committed role of artistic, cultural, and intellectual creation. These, of course, are familiar things in the history of left-wing cultural theory. In recent years, they have been turned ever more insistently to the service of third worldist nationalism. Sometimes this takes ventriloquist forms, with theorists in advanced capitalist countries perceiving, and indeed prescribing, narrowly agitational roles for third world thinkers, writers, and artists, roles which they apparently do not think it appropriate to demand of metropolitan intellectuals. It also finds passionate expression in some minority discourse and those seeking to legislate for it, as in the U.S. Black aesthetic movement in the 1960s. At their most extreme, the demands echoed, consciously or otherwise, a Maoist kind of instrumentalism, as with black cultural nationalist Ron Karenga's 1968 call for black art to expose the enemy, praise the people, and support the revolution. Black art in Gates and McKay, 1997, 1974. Karenga thus insisted, cruelly, that any art that does not discuss and contribute to the revolution is invalid. Black art in Gates and McKay, 1997, 1973. As we shall discover, such anti-intellectual and cultural conservative notions have not only been a recurring presence in Afro-American life, but has gained a new lease of strength in our own times.